Hello. Okay, so behind the scenes, it's been about 4 hours. We had dinner, cleaned up, and gave the 4.5-year-old a bath, put the 4.5-year-old to sleep. Whew! Back to it with our three final artworks for the Italian Baroque. We are going to be staying in one location for these three artworks in the massive new St. Peter's Basilica. Here we are. If this looks familiar to you, I did introduce you to this image when we were talking about the Sistine Chapel, and I said, ignore it, ignore it. It's all a big construction project. And guess what? That construction project has finally been finished in the Italian Baroque period. Now, St. Peter's Basilica is the symbolic seat of the Catholic Church. It is the site of the believed burial of St. Peter, who is the first pope of the Catholic Church. His tomb is located just under this dome. And you'll see here that I have it in yellow. It says New St. Peter's Basilica, which implies that there must have been an old St. Peter's Basilica. Yes, it took over 100 years to construct new St. Peter's on top of the rubble of the old St. Peter's. So here we have an illustration of Rome, and it's highlighting some of the key areas within the city. Across the Tiber River, here is St. Peter's. Let me zoom in on it. You see it? So St. Peter's was built in the early Christian period. It was paid for by none other than Emperor Constantine, the first Christian Roman emperor. And here's another reconstruction. Notice I keep on saying reconstruction. It's because these are all based on archaeological evidence and people's descriptions of what Old St. Peter's looked like before it was demolished and was rebuilt as New St. Peter's. And it was done in the very traditional early Christian style, where there was a gatehouse and an atrium courtyard and a long square building called a basilica, and the church itself was extremely and elaborately outfitted and decorated with a massive candelabras and decadent embroidery for the altar. And at the time of its original completion in the early Christian period, it was a sight. It was amazing. It was beautiful. However, it was getting old, and I mean that it was literally falling apart and small for the size of the congregation that it wanted to accommodate. And so this is another drawing before it was demolished. And so during the Renaissance period, they drew up plans to demolish and rebuild. Here is a plan done by Bramante of the new St. Peter's Basilica. Now, Bramante, he is or was the chief architect to the Pope during the High Renaissance period, and he's the one that designed the Tempietto. So, what we have in his plan, his original plan for new St. Peter's, it's so typical of the Renaissance. Do you see circles? Do you see squares? Totally, yes. Tons of circles and squares. Bramante's plan was to have a massive dome and then four smaller domes and four outer domes, all supported by these half domes. It was an extremely complex design. Now, the cornerstones of the dome, the central dome, were laid, and to encourage funding of the church, they minted these commemorative coins. And these commemorative coins were given to those who had given generously to the construction of the church. And on it was the believed final version of the church. So it was like, okay, thank you for your donation. Here's a coin showing you what we're working towards. And you can see this massive dome. And then, oh, would you look at that? A temple front. Mm-hmm. And then another half dome. And then another temple front. These two things on the sides were going to be bell towers. Now, should not be a shock. We are familiar with the Renaissance looking to the past. Specifically, Bramante was looking to another beautiful example of architecture, also in Rome. It's the Pantheon. The Pantheon was built during the height of the Roman Empire, and it was a temple dedicated to all the gods and goddesses. It also features a central dome with a temple front. So Bramante is very clearly copying that. But it makes sense, right? It's a Renaissance, so rebirth of ancient Roman stuff. And it's right across the river in Rome. Now, as construction continued, Bramante passed away. Don't worry, he lived a very long and successful life. When he died, they hired Michelangelo to look at the plans, and Michelangelo revamped or modified the really complex structure that Bramante had in mind. Here we see the plan under Michelangelo. Because the cornerstones had already been laid for the dome, that was not modified. But you can see in its comparison here, he really streamlined the complexity of those half domes and smaller domes and outer domes into a more controlled space. We can still see circles and squares, but just not as busy or, like I said, complex. Now this period style here, we didn't talk about it in this class. Mannerism is seen as the bridge between the Renaissance to the Baroque, but because we have such limited time together, I just couldn't get into it. If you want to know more about the Mannerist period, it is very interesting, but just think of it as a hybrid between Renaissance and Baroque. If you want to know more, email me. Now, sadly, all that remains of Michelangelo's St. Peter's Basilica is the backside. So if we look at the back of the church, we see the dome, and this was completed just after the death of Michelangelo, but according to his plans. And what we see in the back half is what he had thought of to be the entirety, all four sides of the church. If I have a detail, I don't. Let me just zoom in here. So right away you see there's two different colors of stone. It's not. That's just dirt. This picture was taken during the restoration of the exterior. And so as they cleaned the stone, they started from the top and they worked their way down. So it's not two different stone colors. It's just that's the brown is the dirt and grime of pollution and hundreds of years of existing. So imagine it all to be one color. Now what we have is a very interesting proportion of two levels under a heavy string course or band here, and then a third level above, which we would call like an attic level. It's not balanced, is it? It has a balance of 3, small, medium, large, but this balance is a little offset. It's as if the second level has been absorbed into this first level, creating this odd proportion of attic level to lower levels. Now, I emphasize this not because we're going to look at it in more detail, but because I need you to keep this in mind when we look at the front, because now we're going to flash forward to the Baroque. Okay, so it's under construction and it's coming to completion with the plan of Michelangelo when in the Baroque period, because of the Counter-Reformation, the church decides it's got to be bigger. So the original front of the church was going to be right about here. They decided they needed more floor space. And so they extended the nave. See that word there, nave, N-A-V-E, the front, the central part of the church. They extended it, giving this more floor space, and they hired Carl Maderno to complete it. Now, Carl Maderno, he's familiar with the plans of Bramante and the plans of Michelangelo, and he will consider this when he is making these modifications. Here's the finished exterior. So we see how he's extended it, and now we're going to stand like right about here looking at these front doors. Ta-da! So here's our official artwork for the Italian Baroque. This is Carl Maderno's facade or face of St. Peter's Basilica. And I mentioned Michelangelo's work because you see it? You see how he continued the proportion of Michelangelo's exterior? 2 levels under a heavy string course with a smaller attic level. Do you also see Bramante's influence in this exterior? Yep. There's the dome. There's the pediment. There's the temple front. So Maderno, he's doing something very clever here. He is modifying this to accommodate for the Counter-Reformation's needs and desires, but he's going to keep the lineage of design from Bramante, dome, temple front, and the proportions of design like Michelangelo's 2:1 ratio of the exterior. You might be asking yourself, what about the bell towers? Ooh. The bell towers, they were going to happen. In fact, they had hired Bernini to start on these. They literally came crashing down. They were too big, and the foundations could not hold that kind of weight. And so it was engineering embarrassment. So they're not there now. But everything else still remains. To give you a sense of scale, this church covers over 1 million square feet. It's the biggest church in the world. It also, in comparison to you, check it out. You seeing this? That's people. That's a line of people waiting to get in. This church is massive. It's so big, and that nave, which basically doubled the size of the church, it's so far away from the dome that this view here we're looking at, we're kind of elevated. We're hovering right about here. If we were to really stand in front of this church, this is our view. Okay, Ms. Cortez, what's the big deal? Well, what's missing? We're standing here. What's missing? What did we lose sight of? The dome! The dome is gone. You see it? So if we were to really stand there, the whole connection of dome on the top over the 10th, man, it's gone. It's so big. But it's okay. It does lend for a really picturesque view from farther away. Here we are on the approach to St. Peter's, and imagine if you are a pilgrim on your route to St. Peter's, at least you have that connection of dome and temple front as you make this long procession up to the church. So it's okay. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. Oh man, it's so big though. It's crowned on the top by some holy figures, and again, just to give you a sense of scale, here, this is me, your instructor. I went there in 2012. I'm 5'4". I don't even make it to the base of the column. So, there you go. Now, you might be thinking, I want to go inside. Okay, let's go inside. Here it is. Whoa! So we're standing just inside, and we're looking towards the dome. We're standing in the middle of the nave. behind the dome, or underneath the dome, what you're seeing there is another artwork. It's going to be the artwork that we're going to look at next. But again, I keep on emphasizing it. This size is overwhelming. It's meant to overwhelm you with the presence of God, the majesty of His creation. It's also where the Pietà is. I told you that the Pietà is still in St. Peter's Basilica. If you were to walk in, last time I was there, it was just on this side. So I think it was this aisle here. If you popped in this way, you would be in front of it. But you can only get about this close during most hours. And like I said, it's behind bulletproof glass. So here is a fountain of holy water. And to give you a sense of scale, here are two full-size people. And this is a marble angel holding this massive shell filled with water. It's so big. It's such a big church. So now I'm going to finish this by walking us to the center of the dome and our next artwork, Bernini's Baldacchino.